with the end of Plato and Aristotle, we have gotten to the completion of Greek masters. Next up, we'll start the Roman classicist. And when talking about the Roman classicists in the textbook, we actually have Horace and Quintilian, although in the syllabus we don't have to actually learn Quintilian. So the only Roman classicist we'll be learning is Horace. Then we'll move on to the Romantics, which will start with Longinus. So Horace, the thing with Horace is that Horace lived during the Augustan age. Augustan age meaning being the time where Emperor Octavian Augustus lived. That is actually important because till then, till the period of Augustus, the major form through which literature propagated was through oration, oratory, and prose. But Octavian Augustus, Emperor Augustus, was a huge fan of poetry in general. He wanted poets to bloom and prosper because through poetry he could talk about his greatness. Basically, he could use poetry to advertise his achievements to the people. And this really affected the poets during the time. There was a growth in number of poets. Poetry became a true form which overthrew the ideas of oratory, basically. Now, it was said that, according to adopt Herbert W. Paul's usings on Matthew Arnold, Horace was, of all the Roman poets, he was the best critic, and of all the best Roman critics, he was the best poet. So, he was equally good, equally famous at both poetry and criticism. He has written a lot of works, of which the most famous for the critics is Ars Poetica, also called Art of Poetry. The title was given later by Quintilian. Now, that's all there is about Horace's, introduction. You can move if we move into his views on classicism. It's basically that he propagated and was a believer of the revival of ancient Greek tradition in Rome at the time. Even though Rome had two pre-existing schools, which were the Old Latin and the Modern Alexandria, and he was not a fan of either of them. And he proposed for the third, the revival of the Greek ancient tradition, which is really visible because when you look at his nature and you look at his views of criticism, it really matches the views of like a combination of a unique amalgamation of both Plato and Aristotle's views can be seen by what Horace says. Now we'll move on to his observations of poetry. His view. Okay, so like when you look at it, we can split it into various parts. When we take Horace and poetry, what was poetry? These are the topics that he'll cover. According to him, what is poetry? That's the nature. Why do we have poetry, which is its function? How poetry is, which is its subject matter, what the poetry is about. Then we have the kinds of poetry, how the poetry is written, which is the language used, and the inherent nature of art itself. So we'll begin with the nature of poetry. Now, the thing is that even though he believes to an extent a poet is an imitator, he never really, talks about it directly. He seems to imply it that a poet is a well-instructed imitator who takes his model from life and customs. So, a poet willingly or unwillingly ultimately is an imitator because what he talks about is life and customs, which is technically an imitation. However, it is not mere imitation, but it is more of appearing to the whole nature of poetry is that he believes fiction composed to please should be very near the truth. So just because it's not true, just because it's fiction, doesn't mean it has to be ignored or denied completely. If it is close to the truth and the fiction is enjoyable, it should be appreciated because it is better to resort to believable false than unbelievable truth. So he's not ultimately against imitation. He acknowledges that to an extent it is imitation, but he believes if done right, it's the imitation is inherently good because we know Plato believed, imitation, it's all imitation and it's bad. Aristotle said it's all imitation and it's all good. Whereas Horace is saying, yeah, I agree, it is imitation to an extent, but it's neither good nor bad. It depends on how you use it, which makes it either good or bad. Now, next up, it's the function of poetry. He believes that here's where we really see his views on, the Greek classics, because he believes the function of poetry, his belief on the function of poetry is a perfect mix of the views of Aristotle and Plato. They were technically opposites, but he manages to make like a middle ground in between the two. He believes, and I quote, poets desire either to improve or to please or to unite the agreeable and the profitable. So here we can see all of his philosophies combined into one. The poet should either desire to improve, which is Plato's view, or to please, which is Aristotle's view, or to unite the agreeable and the profitable, which is his political view, the Augustan view in him. The poet has to be profitable, it has to be agreeable to the people should appreciate you. So they should the poetry. While Plato believed that the poetry should inculcate a love of all that is noble in the life of young men. The young men who read the poems for the first time, the views of noble life, virtuous life should invoke inside their mind. And Plato, the Aristotle's view that art imitated life primarily for the pleasure, and rather than any utilitarian useful view. Horace find a middle ground between the two. He believes you will win every vote if you blend what is improving with what pleases, at once delight and instruct the reader. The poet shouldn't just teach the reader. It shouldn't just make the reader feel better. It should teach the reader and make them feel better simultaneously. It has to be pleasure giving and morally improving. The nature of poetry is to charm the mind and at the same time teach them. It should serve both the hedonistic view and the utilitarian view. That's the function of poetry according to Horace. Now, the subject matter, what do we write poems about? He says, let your theme be what it may, provided it is simple and uniform. It can be whatever it is as long as the topic is simple and uniform. What does he mean by that? By simple, he means it has to be familiar material. It has to be taken from life and customs. It has to be relatable to the common man. And by uniform, he means it has to be one whole. It shouldn't have anything extravagant or extraneous or irrelevant. It has to be complete a one organic whole. We talked about the unity of action earlier, right? If there are five parts and one part is taken out, if the entire poetry can function without this one part isn't necessary. We only need these four. So let your theme be what it may, provided it is simple and uniform, and choose a theme suited to your powers and ponder long what way your shoulders refuse to bear. He says, sound judgment is the basis and source of good writing. What does he mean by this? It's that ultimately it doesn't matter how you write, it doesn't matter the words, the diction, the form, the meter, all of this are secondary to the subject matter or the thing. Because if you think about if once you find a theme, once you find a subject, you have to sit and think about it for long. You have to think about it again and again. You have to apply due diligence to it, because only after that, once you have thought about it properly through and through, and your sound judgment doesn't give up on you, then the words, the meter, all will bend to support this. He says, he therefore who chooses his subject wisely will find that neither words nor lucid arrangement will fail him. So the themes, the subject matter has to be simple and uniform. Ultimately, that's all. Now, the thing about kind is that while Aristotle had, a fixed view on kinds, basically, what Aristotle said is that certain meters has to be used for certain types of poetry. He says, and I'm not sure if this has to be by heart or not. I would say just, learn these as examples. When you're when you're writing a poem about the exploits of princes and leaders, the greatness, you're talking about the glory of these princes and kings, you use the epic form. When you're writing about the sad story of war and the tragedies of life, you use dactylic hexameter as used by Homer. When you're writing elegy, mournful elegies or songs of thanksgiving, you use the elegiac measure. When you're writing about tragedy, comedy, or satirical verses, you use the conversational tone, which is the iambic meter. Now, these is what Aristotle believed, and while Horace never really talks against this, he never either supports it either. He basically just went with the flow. It says here, the stress on kinds in Horace therefore merely proceeds from his respect for the ancients and not on any grounds relevant to the art of writing. He never, by due diligence, through thought, supports or says, this form has to be used for X reasons. He never does that. He basically just follows it because he never really thought of it. He followed it because that's what has been the tradition. He's just following the tradition. The issue with this, setting of kinds is that throughout time, kinds forms evolve and new forms come. For example, back then there were no sonnets, there were no ballads, there were no novels, or mixing of kinds such as tragicomedy, dramatic romances, or dramatic monologues. So, you can't really say fixed forms forever because forms evolve through time. When you talk about Horace's views on kinds, you can just say the stress on kinds in Horace therefore merely proceeds from his respect for the ancients and not on ground of any relevance to the art of writing. Now, his view on language, and this is important actually. Horace's remarks on language of poetry are no more than brief resume of Aristotle's thoughts. Sorry about that. He merely thinks there should be a right choice of words and effective arrangement in composition because there should be clearness and effectiveness in the words. He's not a romantic who basically says, write whatever words come to your mind. He's not a classicist, a true classicist who says these kind of words have to be used. The words have to be complex. No, he basically says these words have to have clearness and effectiveness. That's all. These words should be properly selected. They should be done in accordance to the reader. The language has to be liberally used. He says, and I quote, a poet is free to use both familiar words and new if they fulfill the two requirements of expression, being clearness and effectiveness. A clever combination renders a familiar word original when, however, no familiar. Okay, the thing here is that a poet, when using his language properly, will be able to make a known word feel unknown and an unknown word feel known. You will, while reading this poem, if written by a great author, according to Horace, you might find a word that you have never seen before in your life. But just because of the context by which it is used, how it is used, the place where it is used, will make you understand the word without even having to look at the meaning. And a word that you know the meaning of, that you've used a lot of the times, will be used in such a unique way that you don't know if the word is correct there, if the word can even have that meaning. A great poet will be able to make a familiar word be unfamiliar and an unfamiliar word be familiar. He believes a clever combination renders a familiar word original. However, if you come to a crossroads where no familiar word can express what you have in mind, if you're at a point where you have this emotion, you have this thought in mind, but you're not sure if any word that exists in the vocabulary can express that word, you have, as a poet, you have the freedom, you have the license to coin a new word, given it is taken from a Greek source and it is modified slightly. That's all. The poet's skill lies in making the familiar words appear strange and the strange words appear unfamiliar. Familiar. It has to show taste and care. You can't just, throw words randomly around. It has to make sense. It has to be clear and effective. Now, ultimately, nature and art. By nature and art, here the word meanings nature and art are different. By nature, he means the natural skill of the poet. For example, it is in my nature to do something. It is in your nature to do something. Just like that, it is in my nature to write poetry. It is in someone's nature to draw. It is in someone's nature to sing. We some might call it, the modern word for it used to be called talent. That's what he means by nature. And by art, he means the skill that you develop through time. So basically, nature and nurture. You can either be skilled at something by being born skilled at it, or developing it through time. The natural endowment of a man is called nature, and the training in the literary art is called the art. So Horace says, men have asked whether verse wins renown through nature or through art. He's saying, people always ask me, who wins, nature or art? Who wins, the naturally skilled, the naturally talented, or the one who practices through skills? He says, I cannot see how study profits without a vein of genius or skill wins without training. Thus, each gift needs the other's aid and joins in friendly union. He believes both has to come together. They need to both exist because one cannot exist with the other. No one can be a great artist unless he is naturally gifted and unless he undertakes the necessary toil to learn the principles of his craft. You know, uh, if if you are talented but you don't use your skill, you will become a waste. If you have what it takes, if you do train the skill but you don't have the natural composition to it, you will fail. That's what he's saying. He is more concerned, however, he prefers the toil, the more concerned toil with the natural inspiration, because he believes, even to an extent, even those not naturally skilled can become better at poetry through this learning. Hence, ultimately, Horace does not say poetry is merely a matter of rules or genius emitted altogether. It has to exist. Both of these have to exist because he considers the two to be indivisible. He's not saying nature is one, nurture is one. He's not saying nature is one, art is one. They both are indivisible. They are both one. You can't separate the two. There is a happy gift of compromise which had earlier enabled him to reconcile the conflicting claims of profit and pleasure in the poet's object of writing. And that's his view on language. Now, when we go to his observations on drama and his observation of satire, his value of criticism, although it technically, when you look at the grand scheme of things, is important, it's not in our syllabus. Ma'am never took it in class because right after that, we skip to longiness, I believe. We talk about function, immortality of viewing, purpose of synthesis of elements. Uh, Hold on. Yeah, that's all because we basically skip everything else. After that, we directly move to Longinus in the cast. So, looking back at Horace, if you look at it fast enough, we see the age was ruled by Emperor Octavian Augustus. Poetry became famous at the time. Of all the Roman poets, he was the best critic. Of all the Roman critics, he was the best poet. His main work is Ars Poetica, in which all his criticism is seen. His view on classicism, he was a supporter of the ancient revival of the ancient Greek tradition. His observations of poetry is important. He believes the nature is that there is imitation, but the imitation is good because if the imitation is believable, it is almost as good as the truth. The function is to teach and to please and to come together with the collective agreeable and the profitable. It has to do both, and it has to apply to both the hedonistic and the utilitarian. The subject matter should be simple and uniform. Simple means it is taken from the familiar material of life and customs, and uniform meaning it has to be organic and one whole. Sound judgment is what has to come first. The theme comes first. There are various kinds. He did support the various kinds, but it's not because he studied on it, but because that was the tradition. The language has to be clear and effective. Every word has to make sense. A clever combination makes the word original. If you cannot find a proper word, you are, as a poet, you do have the license to term a new coin, provided it is taken from the Greek and it is slightly modified. The poet's skill lies in making the familiar word appear strange and the strange word appear familiar. As for the nature and art, both talent and skill has to come together. There has to be both talent, which he called nature, and skill, which he called art. Both are indivisible and both comes together. You cannot move one from the other. And that's all there is about Horace. Next, we'll quickly move on to Longinus. Longinus is kind of short. It is kind of hard, but once Longinus is done, we're done with the old times, and we'll start classicals, the neoclassicals. Okay, that's all.